Hi guys, welcome to lecture number 5, and in this we are going to be discussing about CMD and the entry point. I am excited because these two topics often confuse many other people. They used to confuse me as well, but when I read about them and I did some hands-on on it, now I think I understand them. So let's dive into this lecture and start with the agenda. So in this lecture, we'll learn about the entry point in Docker, how to write that in a Docker file. Then we discuss about some of the differences between a CMD and entry point. And at the end, we'll discuss about how we can override them from the command line. Now let's talk about some differences between the CMD and entry point. This part denotes the CMD and this part denotes the entry point. The CMD serves as a default command when it runs inside a Docker container. So in a Docker file, when you don't have an entry point, you just have a CMD. In that case, the CMD runs as the default command. So when your container comes up, the CMD is what is going to run. We have seen that in many examples in the previous lectures. If you haven't watched that, please do watch it. The entry point, if it is present, it becomes the default command. So when you don't have a CMD present inside your Docker file and you just have an entry point, that becomes an entry point. This also gives us an important indication that in a Docker file, we should always have either of them. We can have both of them as well. This also gives us an indication that in a Docker file, we should have CMD or an entry point or both of them. But without these two, there's no point having a Docker file, because then we wouldn't have anything to run when the Docker container is run. So as I've written in the next point, that it is mandatory to have either a CMD or an entry point in a Docker file. The word mandatory is somehow confusing here, because you can opt to have not to have an entry point and a CMD in your Docker file, but in that case the Docker file will not be of any use. So if both CMD and entry point are present, then the entry point acts as a default command and the CMD acts as its default arguments. So let's see this point in action. I'm going to head back to the terminal now. So for example, I open a Docker file. In this, I have an entry point and I've written bin bash -c, and the CMD says echo hello world. So as I said, when both of them are present, whatever is written inside the CMD becomes an argument to whatever is written inside the entry point. So I've carefully chosen the commands here. So the first command says bin bash -c, which expects an argument after C, and the argument now becomes echo hello world. The final command will look like bin bash -c echo hello world. This will be the final command that will be run, and as we can understand, the output should be hello world. Let's build this image. Docker build -t day -5, and I have a normal file called Dockerfile, so I don't need to specify -f. The build context is dot, so I'm going to build this. Then I'm going to run the day 5 image, and when I do that, and I'm not specifying any other command, because if I specify another command, it is going to override the command written inside it. By command I mean the CMD block. So if you write something here, this is going to override whatever is written inside your Docker file in the CMD part. So I'm not going to do that, because I wanted to do the default operations. In this case, it printed hello world. So now the crazy thing can also happen if I do ls. So what happened now? The command changed. Not the default command, which was bin bash -c. This was a default command written inside our entry point. You see, in the entry point, we wrote this. This was the default, and this was the argument to this. Since I can replace the CMD from command line, I can let the default command as it is, and I can pass different arguments here. So this can be pretty cool stuff. So you can give a default thing to your Docker container, like you want to prepare some container files, you want to have logging set up, you want to create a directory structure, or you want to start a daemon, for example. Or if you're running a database inside your container, maybe you want to start that daemon as a default, and then allow the user to pass in some arguments to the database. That you can do in the CMD part. So coming back to my point, I can easily overwrite the CMD block from outside. So for example, I ran ls. So effectively, the command becomes bin bash, because that was our default command written in the entry point, and we wrote ls. So this is what the final command which Docker ran and gave you that output. So the next point is, if the multiple CMD statements are present, only the last one executes. So it's like they override each other. So if you have multiple CMDs, which is not right to do that, but if you have multiple CMDs, only the last one will be executed. So if I open my Dockerfile again, and I keep writing more statements here, echo second CMD, then I write last CMD. So what do you guys think that we should be seeing on the terminal if I run this Docker container? We build it again. Always make sure that whenever you change in your Docker file, always build it and then run it. So I'm not going to give a default command here. I'm going to let the command inside Docker run. So I'm not going to specify any command after the image name. So let's see which of the CMDs actually run. We have 3 CMDs inside it. You saw that the last CMD ran. And similar is the case when you write entry point here. If you have multiple entry points, okay, so similar is the case when you have multiple entry points in your Docker file. So I'm going to remove all these statements. So now let's write some command, or let's have a CMD along with it as well, just to make things more clear. I'm going to say echo last entry point, right? And the last should be, in my case, I'm going to write it like this. So the last entry point will be used, which is Python -c, and Python -c is also expecting a command to be passed to Python, and that command is going to be import this. So I'm going to show you that first on my terminal, and then we're going to run this via the Docker container. So when you write Python -c and you pass something to this, for example this, you will see something like this, right? This is a Python Easter egg These are some rules that get printed when you run the import this module. So let's remove this, and I'm going to run the same thing but from a container now. So I'm going to build that container. I'm going to run this container, and you see the same stuff. So this happened because effectively what Docker did was that you had multiple entry points here. You see step number 2, 3, and 4. They both had entry points. But as I told you, the last entry point is what is going to execute, not the other ones. So we had Python -c, and as we know, the CMD, if present, becomes a default argument to the entry point. So Python -c, and after that we appended, or Docker appended, import this. And so this command ran, and you got this output. Now, the last point is that we can overwrite the Docker commands when we are doing Docker run. We have already seen that the last command, the last thing that you write inside Docker run is what actually replaces the CMD block inside your Docker file. You can do the similar stuff. You can still overwrite an entry point as well when you do a Docker run command, and we will see that. This requires an -- entry point option in the Docker run command. So let's see how to override an entry point from a command line. We have already seen that we can do the override for a CMD as well when we write anything here. So when we write anything at the end of Docker run, that becomes a command and then replaces the command inside a Docker file. Now let's see, can we do this with an entry point or not? We can. So after your run command, you write entry point, and in quotes you write your executable. In that case, I want my entry point to be a bash, not Python, which is currently written inside it. And I want to run echo from CMD. I want to do this. You see that I have overwritten the entry point using the -- entry point, and I have also overwritten the command from the command line, because as I told you, anything that you write after the image name becomes your command that you are trying to run inside a Docker. If there is a CMD inside, that gets replaced. I keep on repeating this because this is very confusing, and just so that you get it correctly, I'm trying to do this again and again. This was how you overwrite an entry point and a command from the terminal using the Docker run command. Before we discuss the exercise for today, let's talk about the Dockerfile of the MySQL database. It's quite famous, and most of us have been using this, but let's see and dive into its Dockerfile and see what they are doing. This is the base image that they're using. It's a Debian flavor that they're using, and the tag is Buster Slim. And all these commands, I'm going to skip it because these are just some software installations, some configuration with the environment variables, again some run commands. Ignore this volume as well because we're going to discuss volumes in the next lecture, but understand that this is just to have a persistent storage attached to this container. And then some copying commands, we have already seen that. And then we have an entry point. This entry point is trying to invoke a script file, and they also have a CMD. So as I told you, when we have both of them, the CMD becomes an argument to the entry point. That means this shell script is invoked with this argument. So now let's see what the entry point looks like. This is the file. So this is the entrypoint.sh file. I'm going to come down because all these are just functions. The starting point of the script is this. So if this file has not been invoked anyhow, then we do this, we call the main function and pass in $@. By $@, we'll get all the arguments passed into this script. And as I showed you earlier, the argument passed to this was MySQL. So that means main is invoked with MySQL as an argument. So this main function is executed, and at the end we execute MySQL. So what this script is trying to do is it is trying to do some setup, then it is trying to stop the MySQL server, and then again at the end of it, it is executing MySQL, which is again starting the server again. So it is doing some setup, installing some softwares, doing the setup for you, and at the end stopping it, and at last starting it again. So this is how this image is using the entry point and the CMD together. So this is what we've seen, that how the Dockerfile uses both entry point and CMD block. I've pasted the link as well. I'm going to share this link in the YouTube description as well. In the purple color is to denote the argument that was passed into the script, which was MySQL and was passed on to the main method. So they have created a script file which they invoked in the entry point. The CMD, they gave MySQL. So MySQL acted as an argument to the script. So something like this was invoked. It called the main method with MySQL, and the main method did some stuff, stopped the MySQL at the end of it. It started the MySQL again. So this is how it was being used. Just to give you an idea how an entry point and CMD are being used by some popular databases. So if you're writing a database, or you're writing a web server, or something that requires a default setup, I would recommend using the entry point and CMD along with each other. The exercise is nothing special. I want you guys to practice the CMD and entry point by writing that in your Dockerfile. I also want you guys to practice how to send in multiple commands to an entry point. If you have a Python as an entry point, that means I want you to write a for loop as your command and pass that to your entry point. Try that and see if you run into some problems. If your command is big enough, why not write a shell file for it and use that and see if you run into some errors. And if you do, make sure to use the YouTube's comment section to share the problems with us, and I will definitely help you out. So this brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope you now understand how CMD and entry point work together and how can you use them in your Dockerfile. If you face any problems, please use the YouTube's comment section to raise your queries, and I'll be happy to help you out. Don't forget to like and subscribe my channel and share it with all your friends. In the next lecture, we'll talk about Docker volumes, and they are quite interesting as well. So stay tuned, keep learning, stay home, and stay safe. Bye bye.